Welcome to Talkin Tires, the podcast that delves deep into the world of tires. Join us as we explore everything from the science behind the manufacturing to the latest innovations in tire recycling. Our aim is to provide you with a comprehensive understanding of tires, including how they work, how to maintain them, and how to dispose of them responsibly. Whether you're a seasoned mechanic, curious car enthusiast, or an avid recycler, Talkin Tires is the perfect podcast for anyone who wants to learn about the essential component of the modern vehicle and heavy equipment. So buckle up and join us for an informative and engaging journey into the world of tires.
All right, welcome to another episode of Talkin Tires. I'm your host, Craig Hunter, the president of Tire Reclaim, and I got here with me Stratton. Stratton is from Liberty Tire Recycling, and why don't you give us your specific term, because I know you're in lobbying and things like that, but your specific title.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have one of those great sort of titles that doesn't really sound like what I do. So my title is Vice President of Corporate Affairs. And essentially what that means is I represent us before, public entities, county governments, state governments, municipal governments, and then I also handle our communications and marketing.
Fantastic. Well, I apologize to have to make you explain that, but it really was, I didn't know. Lobbyist was not the right term because I know you're vice president at Liberty Tire, but getting into that, and welcome. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And Liberty Tire does a lot of things, and I got to meet a lot of your great folks at the Liberty Tire get together a couple weeks ago in North Carolina, and that was very interesting. A lot of different personalities, a lot of different knowledge and background in tire recycling. So I wanted to first learn a little bit about Stratton. Like, how did you get started in tire recycling? Like, what most guys say they tripped and fell in it or something like to those to that accord. But tell us a little bit about Stratton. Like, where do you hail from?
Yeah, so I originally grew up in the Panhandle of Florida. So I grew up on a farm, very small community. My hometown is still less than 300 people. So the opposite of what people typically think of when they think of Florida. But so for better or worse, I moved to DC almost 20 years ago. And I've been in the DC area. I live in Maryland now. And I sort of a little bit of a traditional path, a little bit of non-traditional path. I worked on Capitol Hill for a few years. I had worked on some campaigns. Then I moved overseas and came back, and I actually started doing sustainability consulting. So working on public affairs, where policy and communications meet for everyone from small companies to large companies on what their sustainability goals were and how to talk about those and how to get those implemented. And so through that, I ended up working with the Recycled Rubber Coalition for a very long time, of which Liberty is one of. And eventually, I sort of got to a place where I think, as a lot of people will probably sympathize with, the last few years, maybe even longer than that, it doesn't really feel like DC is a place where you get a whole lot done. You spend a lot of time talking past each other and not actually working on things together. And so I was really looking for an opportunity where I could continue my focus on environmental and energy issues, which have always been my passion, but actually move the needle a little bit. And so I was talking to some of my clients, and there was an opportunity at Liberty, and I jumped at it, because at that point I'd known them for several years. I really liked the company, the culture, and the mission. And as you know, from being in the same space, what I really love about, our industry and our companies when it's structured right is that the economics drive the sustainable outcomes, right? Sustainability isn't like, some sprinkles that we just put on top for publicity. It's like our model actually encourages us, the more tires that get into the legitimate flow, that we collect.
Real.
Yeah. It means that sustainability for our industry isn't optional. It's built into the core of it. And I think that's great. So that's the short version.
Yeah. So is that, you went really quick there. So when you were going overseas and you got into sustainability, was that really, it sounds like that was a passion, is the word you use, like something that you would say is a core belief of yours, is that we should be recycling things. I learned about a local hero to a lot of people in Idaho is a guy named J.R. Simplot. You may have never heard of him, but basically he made McDonald's French fries amongst many other things. But my wife's family has worked there for many, many decades, all different positions with J.R. Simplot. And she was telling me about how reutilizing waste has been a core of their business model for a long time. I didn't know that, and it was very interesting to learn. So, would you say that recycling, sustainability, has that been a belief of yours for a long time? Then, like when you first got started, all the way up to now?
Yeah, I think so. Probably not unlike a lot of people. I think a lot of it comes from where I grew up in Florida. I grew up on a farm in a very rural county. I would say approximately 100% of my activities were outdoor related. I grew up riding horses, working on the farm, kayaking, fishing. Florida's flat, so I wouldn't call it hiking, but a lot of time spent outdoors. And that's continued through to this day. So I think, rather than the term like environmentalist, right, I would think of myself as a conservationist. We need to find the right balance between human access and human prosperity in keeping an environment that we all benefit and can use. So I definitely think that's part of it. I would say from a policy perspective, what always really appealed to me about environmental and energy issues is those are two ones that are universal, right? You can't talk about any other issue, whether it's trade or defense or agriculture, without environment and energy really being at the core of it. So that's part of why that's always really been my focus, both when I started on Capitol Hill, through consulting, through my time at Liberty.
Well, that seems like a perfect fit because if, I look up to Liberty in some of the practices that they utilize, and even not just the tire recycling, but the way that you guys are able to utilize every mile driven, fuel conservation, route structure, things like that. Like, obviously, it's important for us to model, to look, we really look up to Liberty Tire like a big brother in some senses where, hey, they really pay attention to this and this. We should too, right? And that's one I would say is routing and utilizing your trucks the best you possibly can, because that's every mile driven, right? That makes sense.
Yeah.
So you obviously picked a very good company to represent that and kind of have that core. I don't know if you watched Captain Planet as a kid. I mean, I think you and I are not, but I think a lot of us got the bug early on, and good on those folks that were marketing back in the day. Whoever was pushing that type of thing, because it's a core value for me. Like, I've been in a lot of different sectors through recycling, and I've realized that came from somewhere. Like, that didn't just fall from the sky. And I know that, Liberty's probably a great outlet for you for that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think as an organization, we try to be pretty humble most of the time, but to what you're referring to, I would say if I can toot our own horn for a little bit, it is nice because we are a leader in this space, that I do think we have an obligation, hopefully of fulfilling that, to also talk about those best practices and share those with the industry, both in North America and worldwide. Because it's funny. Coincidentally, I also grew up in a little bit of the construction and demolition space. My grandfather ran a landfill. I worked there during the summers at the gate, weighing trucks coming in and out. I would say he was maybe this is where my core value comes from. He was the ultimate recycler, because mornings with him would start out at 5 a.m., go out to the landfill, pull out the good boards, pull out the nails. He would actually make me hammer them straight to reuse the nails.
I love it.
But like thinking about, how can we model things in an industry that a lot of times, we're called solid waste, right? And I don't think people often think associating solid waste with advanced technology and like using route optimization and using AI. But, there's a lot of opportunity in our space to not only take what is a core sustainable model, but really build on that and look at how can our trucks and our fleets be more sustainable? How can our sites themselves be more sustainable? And again, for me, it also goes back, the economics underlie all of those things and really encourage us when we can say, it's like, oh, we've increased our fleet efficiency, our route efficiency by 9%. And not only is that good for the environment, but that translates into real dollars too.
Absolutely. Well, and you guys are very forward facing about all of that, which I love. I'm kind of that nerd that I look forward to seeing the sustainability report, which you guys put out annually. You don't have to do that. It's something that I think is probably part of your sustainability goals as being, uh, I'm open about some of
Yeah.
those projects and the way that you do that. And if you play a role in any of that, I'd commend you just on sharing and talking about it, being on this
Yeah.
podcast, which is just a platform really for people in the industry. We've had people from most recently a lot from the recycled asphalt or or rubber modified asphalt
Okay.
sector. And we're, every part of sustainability plays a role. That one just feels like it fits. And I don't know why the technology hasn't really taken off more than it has to this point. But has there been any projects that were kind of like a pivotal for you in your career with Liberty? I mean, was there any kind of aha moments like, oh, wow, this is big. Like we really need to stay focused on this or that? Or is it kind of all of it encompassing? Or yeah, is there anything you could talk about?
Well, I will tell you, because we as an industry are traditionally governed at the state level, it does feel like you're sort of playing whack-a-mole sometimes, and you can make really great progress in one state that doesn't necessarily translate to another state. But what I will say is I do think, if you look at the number of states that have taken a, constructive look at their waste tire, their scrap tire laws in the last really only 4 years, it does sort of feel like we're pretty close to a tipping point, because it didn't used to look like it was systemic. But now when you're looking at, you have states all the way from, Colorado and Utah, and certainly there's been legislation in Idaho that hasn't passed yet, but, we're optimistic. But a bunch of work in the Southeast, New Jersey in the Northeast, Connecticut, California, looking at electronic manifest systems. It does feel like for the first time really in 30, 35 years that the states are sort of waking up. Okay, when we put these laws together, it was really about just removing those historic piles that used to be on the ground back when the US had a billion tires on the ground, billion with a B. And 30, 35 years later, we've made huge progress, right? Like that can't be said enough, but our challenges are different. It's like we have more retails, we have more tire generators, which means more collection points, more opportunities for tires to get missed or picked up by low-end haulers and dumped illegally. So it's almost like, a more complicated environment because we're not just focusing on a few very large piles. Instead, we have a ton of operators, a ton of maybe small illegal dumps or illegal storage. And so it can feel overwhelming at times, but I really do feel like because of the advocacy in the industry and because of education in the industry, which are, one and the same thing, that it feels like we're at a point where people are really taking a holistic look at this and starting to think. I certainly encourage them beyond state lines, because as we know, just because you have a great program in one state doesn't mean those tires stop at the border.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily translate, right? And we've learned that here in Idaho, because we'll get advice, right? I'll talk to guys from all across the country, and I'm like, wait, doesn't really apply, because of this, and this. But speaking of that, do you have any favorites? Do you have any crown jewels, if you will, of states that have really embraced maybe some of your ideas or kind of led with some of the things? Do you have a favorite? Like an example?
Well, of course, if I'm talking to any state, I'm going to tell them they're all my favorite, right?
They're your favorite, right?
But,
I get you. Yeah. You truly are. You are in the right sector.
I would say two states that have done a really good job, but in slight variations, are Georgia and Utah for different reasons. Utah, because I would say both have market-based systems. So, the primary operator is the private sector with state regulation and enforcement and an agency that oversees the program. But Utah has what I would say is driven more by like an economic model where instead of having a defined grant program and saying, these are the uses for it and this is how much money we're going to give out, they have, an incentive based on a hierarchy of waste that says, for when you process tires and use tires, and I think it's very important, this incentive actually goes to the end user, not the processor. And they say when you use a recycled material from tires, if you're using it at the highest end, so for us, that would be crumb rubber, some application of crumb rubber, you get, this much extra incentive per ton. And we'll go all the way down to energy recovery, so tire-derived fuel, and you'll get this much per ton. And landfilling gets nothing. So it just takes that tire fee that the state collects and just puts the thumb a little bit on the scale to help make the economics a little more better for people who might be interested in tire-derived material. Georgia is the other one, again, a market-based system, but they do take more of a grant-based approach. But what I really like about Georgia is how comprehensive their system is for helping local governments. They do have a tire product grant, but what I really love about Georgia is they have something called the STAR grant. And for that, it means every county and every municipality in Georgia automatically qualifies for up to $75,000 a year for amnesty programs, so hard to recycle materials. So in this case, tires, and then for cleanups. And, to me, what I always say why that is so important is, our industry recycling rate is around 80%, but our management rate, meaning we know they go from a generator to a legitimate outlet, whether it's recycling or disposal, is 97%. I think most commodities would kill to have that 97%, right? That's an A plus. But when you produce 315 million scrap tires in the US every single year, that missing 3%, represents anywhere from 9 to 12 million tires. Now, not all of those are ending up, illegally dumped or stockpiled. Some we just don't know, but a small percentage can have a big impact. So having that steady resource that doesn't have to be appropriated every year, that's not available only once every 3 years, that counties and cities know they can count on every single year, helps get that small amount that might end up at an individual's garage, or a tractor tire on a farm, gets them into the legitimate flow instead of just getting stockpiled or illegally dumped. So I would say those I would just say those two at a high level are my favorite. There are some other good models or other things that states do really, really well. But I think what I like about those is Utah, if you're looking for a very simple model that produces good diversity and outcomes, that's Utah. If you're looking at a model that has all of the sort of building blocks you would want to see in a program, it's going to be like a Georgia or an Ohio, which is similar.
So sorry to interrupt you there, but I was thinking about, so I understand the Utah one. That's what we're trying to model in Idaho or similar, which we do a lot in Idaho. We look at, what's working for our neighbors type thing. Mm-hmm. And I know how that is funded through, rebate and a tire rebate or a tire charge per tire. Is Georgia similar? Is it a per tire charge?
Georgia is similar, and it's also just $1 per tire. Yeah.
Okay. $1 per tire.
Gotcha. $1 per tire. Yeah. The biggest, you probably know this. I would say one of the biggest challenges is in a lot of states, because those programs were set up to focus on those historic piles, and those historic piles got cleaned up. So over the years, in an awful lot of states, those tire fees stayed on the books. But as those tire piles got cleaned up, that money started going to other places. And so now there's a lot of work to try to claw that back, because I think it would shock people in a lot of states if they knew how much money their state was collecting to handle waste tires. But at the same time, very little, if any of it, is actually going to those tires. And I will say that is actually, again, something that Utah and Ohio and Georgia do different, is that they actually make sure those fees go to their intended purposes.
Well, and that was my next line of questions, was auditing. How does some of that work? How do they, is that, you said there was a board that kind of advises or regulates that type of thing. Is that someone from the DEQ? Is that someone from the state government? How do they determine that the money's being appropriated, appropriately spent?
Yeah. Well, in a lot of states, it's not. There are an awful lot of states, Washington State next door being one, that collects a whole lot of money in tire fees. and it just automatically goes into their transportation budget. A similar situation in New Jersey, for instance, where almost all of the money, if not all of the money, goes into something transportation related. In the states where they actually are, spending the tire money on tire related things, I would say, one, you're correct. It's typically somebody in a DEQ or an EPA, a state environmental agency. And then sometimes it gets divided because sometimes you have the regulatory side and then sometimes you have like the programmatic side. And so on the regulatory side, that would be the people who inspect our facilities, right? But then on the programmatic side, those are the people who oversee like the grant making. I would say for me, and this might be a little bit controversial in the industry. There are a number of states that do give grants to the private sector. And, Liberty has certainly been a company that has received some of those. I think in those states, the bar for those grants needs to be very, very high because, this is an industry that it's really hard. And I think a lot of people don't realize it's as hard as it is. And if taxpayer dollars are getting invested in the private sector, we need to make sure that there's a very clear return for the taxpayer. So in most instances, I think in Georgia, for instance, how they account for that is they don't give grants to the private sector. They go only to counties or municipalities. So those are going through the public sector. I will say overall, and I apologize, I know this is the right audience. I can obviously talk about these things for a long time, so I tend to go on. I would say in general, one of the areas, when we're looking at other program models like in Canada or Europe, one of the areas, I generally am a big advocate of the American system. One area where we are weaker compared to the other ones is on that transparency and oversight. There are some states that require an annual report on their tire programs, but a lot of them don't. So in terms of outcomes, in terms of, where the money's going, it's really a black box. One state I'm happy to pick on because it is my, home state, so I feel like I can get away with it, is Florida, right? Tracing where that tire money goes, because it just all goes into a solid waste trust fund, and then it gets mixed together with other funds, and you don't know what's going out there. That is a really difficult one. And they don't publish an annual waste tire report, so you don't know what the status is on the ground, the number of generators, the number of illegal dumps, where the money's getting spent, where it's not getting spent. And I understand, right? The more reports and things like that you put on an agency, the sort of less time they have for real work. But you do want some level of transparency and accountability. And I definitely think that's a weakness in many states right now.
I think that you mentioned AI technology with e-logs, with all these different, data controlling type systems that are out there, it wouldn't be hard. It wouldn't bog down the end user or the recycler, if you will, too much to be able to track some of that. And, again, I don't want to pick on anybody, but that Washington State thing, it's a little interesting that they have one of the biggest cleanups in the United States right now. It's public, so I know I'm not whistleblowing anybody, but I think they're 7,300 tons of tires in one spot. And, everything from baled tires to loose tires to shredded tires, they've got everything in that. And, you and I have talked about this, and they have one of the higher fees for tire, recycling. And you're telling me now, or I'm learning from you, that they don't have, or they don't spend it specifically to tire recycling, then it goes to a transportation fund.
Yeah,
is that
you're
right?
And I've said this publicly too, so there's nothing to hide here. I mean, back of the envelope math, I think the state is probably collecting around $37 million in tire fees per year, and I think they allocate about 600,000 of that to their tire cleanup program. So I think that would be the definition of the drop in the bucket.
Yeah, and there's I would say I don't want to even guess what 7,300 tons of tires is going to cost to clean up, but it's a little bit more than, I think at one point I heard him say 600,000 or something like, or maybe you said that just now, that's way short of that cleanup.
I forget the exact fund name, but I think because that money's not going into a tire cleanup fund, they're having to pull from other sources that I would assume were intended for something else, In pulling all of our threads back together, my understanding of how this site started too, right, was it was somebody who
Government official.
had an idea, sold a story, got some government funding, got some local contracts that they probably weren't qualified to handle, and then stayed in business because of some political connections a lot longer than they probably should have. And then at the end of the day, the state's going to have to pay to clean up that mess too, and I think this is something we see a lot of times in our industry, right? Is sometimes there's hesitation on the part of the regulator for people who aren't meeting the standards on the books to crack down on them, because they're like, well, where are the tires are going to go? And it's like, well, you're going to pay in the short term or the long term, because, if you have somebody who is taking tires but not processing them, or they don't have a home for that material when they process it, you're going to have to clean that up when they go out of business or if they skip town. And it's like, so there has to be a standard level of enforcement to make sure that if somebody's taking a tire, they're actually doing what they say they're doing.
Yeah, and hey, I'm not here to judge. I'm here to learn. I tell my adult children that all the time. Like, mistakes are going to happen, right? It would be nice that if all of us can take a look at what the mistakes that are being made, not just in Washington State, in other states across the union. Idaho got way behind on tire cleanups. We're very proud at Tire Reclaim to be a part of a lot of those cleanups and getting into. My partner mentioned it today. One of the cleanups we did had tires from 1977. We did some of the code. You can check on the tires; they have code dates right on them. And down at the bottom, we found some really old tires. That's to show you how old it is. That's the year I was born. So not to date myself, but those tires have almost been there 50 years. That shouldn't happen, right? Like if people are doing their job, how many people drove by that pile over and over, year after year, saying, we need to do something about that. We need to do something about that. And then finally we got, we were able to work with the local county and get, the property owner had to sign over the deed on his property to help pay for the shredding.
Yeah.
Like there was multiple things. We had the landfill got involved to be able to help take some of those shreds, because some of them were so old they were just completely useless as far as recyclable materials and things like that. So it was a collaboration of a lot of different folks. But a lot of folks drove by that pile for a lot of years. And, I'm sure there was probably different officials that wanted to do something, but their hands were tied. So I want to just make sure that, I'm not just pointing a finger. It's really just, if I'm pointing two thumbs, if anything, is that I want to be part of not letting that happen again. We say here at Tire Reclaim that we are raising our families in Idaho, and we hunt and fish and camp and in this state, and we don't want to see tire piles, because we make friends like Tom in Dallas Fort Worth area, Tom Parker, who's told me about guys will disconnect their lights and drive out in the middle of the country and just dump truckloads of tires, right? And things like that, which I don't want to see that happen in Idaho. So giving a nice, safe outlet, an affordable outlet for tires that guys don't feel like they have to go to those extremes. That's very important. A why for me, if you will, something that helps me swing my legs out of bed in the morning is like, all right, we're doing something good for the state and we're making some progress. So I don't necessarily want to pick on Washington, because Idaho's had their issues, and I'm sure you see state after state that need to get some work done. But that's good to learn, circling back to Georgia and Utah, which I'm glad we're using Utah as a model to try to get something going for Idaho. Are there other projects? Again, I asked about aha moments or, things that are going on, federally that you can talk about. Have you been working in DC much, or is it still kind of that, like you're saying, talking through or talking past people, or however you worded that?
I've been having some conversations with the EPA, both in the headquarters and in some of the regions. And actually, I would say, I think where their focus is what is probably going to be most helpful is, one of the challenges we have, right, is running into jurisdictional bureaucratic challenges. I was talking with a locality in Georgia about this, where they were trying to do some cleanups, but it was a county government but then they had tires that were both on county land, city land, and on some private land. And they were just talking about the process they had to go through to get permission, even though they were willing to pay for the cleanup. But to like get the permission between the different jurisdictions and property owners meant that from day one to where the project was finished took months, just the paperwork. And so I've been having some conversations with some of the EPA regions to talk about, okay, where are we seeing dumping challenges and where are the systemic, challenges in terms of, okay, a state might not have a tire program, but if we're going to invest money in a cleanup, what does that mean if there's not, good rules or a program in place to stop those tires from coming back, and making sure that all of those things are going to try to line up at the same time, so that if there is going to be money invested, like in mitigation and cleanup, that hopefully it means that site's going to be cleaned up permanently and not just something we have to come back to a year from now. But it's funny you mentioned that tire from 1971, because I'm sure you're the same way. I can't help but see tires everywhere I go now. So I include a lot of them in my presentations. And I live very close to the Potomac River here in Maryland. And I go down there to walk and to hike a lot. And I have a picture from a tire that I looked at that DOT stamp on it too. And it's from 1971. And I include that tire in my presentation because, its tread hasn't separated. There's no wire poking through. The sidewall's still intact. Amazing. It's still on the rim. And I always make the point that like one of the reasons that our industry is so important is because left to their own devices, these things aren't going anywhere. And when we're producing more than 300 million of them every single year, that adds up really quick if we weren't here.
Yeah. And, I think the same thing, how we take a tire to its smallest form, and it's designed to be durable, to last forever. Yep. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. Well, it's the same in decomposition. Like it's not going to just go away. It's not, I think I heard someone say 500 years. I don't know how they would know that, but that it would take that long for a tire to break down. I don't know that it would ever break down, honestly. Yeah. I see the teeth on the machine that we have to sharpen regularly to chew that thing up. I don't know that a tire would go anywhere in 500 years. But to your point, it's important to stay on top of these things and to find good outlets and to find ways to get governments to work together. How frustrating would it be to have something funded and not be able to do it like you're talking about? Like there's just too many bureaucratic hoops to jump through that you can't get to the goal line, even though you have someone willing to pay to do the work. I mean, that's gotta be. Absolutely. Are there other frustrations? I'm sure that's probably one of them. Is there something else in the industry that kind of makes you go, I wish we could do that better as a society, or
I would only say,
question.
No. I would only say, at the highest level, it's challenging to have. I guess the challenge is there are definitely a number of states where they want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? It's like where you'll talk to the state and they're like, we want 100% recycling rate. And we're like, okay, great. We're happy to help you get there. What are the end markets we can use for it? And then you'll talk to them and they'll say, well, we don't like crumb rubber. We don't like rubber mulch. We don't like aggregate, and it's like, we don't like tire derived fuel. And it's like, okay, well, if you want recycling, it has to go somewhere. And we're certainly not saying that needs to be at a trade-off of like environmental or human health risks or anything like that, but it's like at the end of the day, you can either have disposal or recycling, but if you have recycling, you need end markets. And you can't go and say, we hate every single end market, but we also want recycling. And to me, I think it would surprise a lot of people, and it certainly has in my conversations, where like, look, Texas has a huge problem with illegal dumping, but when you look at the recycling and beneficial rate, it's much higher than California's. And I think a lot of people would be shocked by that, but it's because California has backed off of a lot of end markets for recycled material. And as a result, their landfilling rate has gone up a lot. And, I think if people pulled back holistically, they would realize, oh, that is not the outcome that we want. So we should really think about how like our policy, our rules, and our rhetoric line up for those outcomes that we really want to see.
Well, and would you say that education is a big part of that? I mean, when you talk about, because the EPA report that I read in April of 2024 And the most recent one, I think, was just again in April this year from the California.
California. Yep.
Yeah, they're talking about it being non-hazardous, being safe for humans. We had someone bring up 6-ppbd and the salmon, coho salmon, and I know there's still a lot of studies being done on that, but most of it from tire wear itself on the roads, not
Right.
necessarily a rubber modified asphalt, because that's cooked into the asphalt. But yet I get a little bit of pushback on that for that,
Yep.
which it's not even related. They're not even the same conversation, but what's some of the things that Liberty Tires doing, or maybe some of the conversations that you've had surrounding education, because these are stakeholders and decision makers that really just don't know what they're talking about. Would you agree?
I would agree. And, look, I struggle, right? Because on the one hand, sometimes when there are conversations around this, you're like, well, if you're going to talk about a rule or a regulation or a piece of legislation, you want somebody to do their homework on the issue. But on the other hand, I assume that 99.99999% of the population spends a significant less amount of time thinking about tires than you and I do, right? Like, for the vast majority of the population, your end of life tires are getting changed at the retail shop, and that's the last time you ever have to think about them. So I struggle with that. But I would say we do a few things. Certainly, it's a huge part of what I do is just education. I think what's great, but has been a challenge through the industry is because, questions about human health and safety before this US EPA report and the California EPA report that you mentioned were sort of hanging out there for so long, is there actually have been so many studies done, and none of them have come back and shown any risk or, higher risk or danger to people. And then when you have the studies like the US EPA report, which was jointly done with the Consumer Product Safety Commission and the Centers for Disease Control, and then the California EPA, which is famously not industry friendly.
Yeah.
Those I think really are pretty definitive. And I do think there has been a change once people learn about those. But it's a big issue, not a topic that people think or spend a lot of time thinking about. So reaching them with that education has been a huge challenge and is something we're going to continue to work on. I would say two very specific things outside of my work is, we're members of the Recycled Rubber Coalition with a lot of other people. That one sort of does more in-depth, wonky, deep dives on issues. So it's like if you really want to talk about microplastics or 6-ppdq, like that's the place you want to go. And then we're also members of the Better Play Initiative, which that's one that I would say is more at a consumer level, and really came out of some of our conversations with parents, because I've had probably hundreds of conversations with parents who will literally tell me something like, oh, I saw something scary on the internet. I just wanted to know, is this safe? And you talk to them for a few minutes, you talk about the science behind it, and they're like, oh, great, that's all I need to know. So Better Play is really focused on, why do these surfaces exist? Why is, rubber in a track or crumb rubber in a synthetic turf field or poured in place or rubber mulch on a playground the best, not just because it's a recycled material, but just the best application and material you can use. And here's the science that completely supports its safety for your kids and your family as well. And so that campaign has really reached out to broader audiences, people who are, they don't want to spend, 30 minutes or an hour reading a white paper. They just want to know what are the high levels so I can feel like, I've done my due diligence as a parent. So those are two very specific initiatives in addition to the work that I would say I do every day.
Well, and I'm glad you make a great point. A stakeholder, a decision maker, or a government official, they have a lot of things that cross their desk, right? And we can't expect them to know everything about everything. So they get, probably, and matter of fact, I spent some time with state senators in Idaho, and they were getting bombarded. Like I had 6 minutes with one, and then as soon as I walked out, I'm crossing another guy that's going in there to talk to him about the Potato Council, right? So like it's just coming at them all the time, and so that's a fair statement, and I appreciate you bringing that up. So it is really an education, but you talk about, you speak to hundreds of families or parents or whatnot, and that back to that drop in the bucket. Think of how many millions of kids are running around. So I love the play Play. Is it Better Play, right? Better
Better play.
Play.
Yep.
Yeah, I love that. I try to forward as many of those as I can and just kind of spread the word as far as the safety of chrome rubber and rubber products. And not just the fact that it's, safe as a non-hazardous material, but the compaction, like your kid falling off the swing, it's softer. It
I know
literally is softer.
you mentioned you have a 5-year-old and I have a 5-year-old too. And I mean, one, I have rubber mulch in my backyard around our play set for that reason. But I can say from my child falling off the monkey bars directly on his head, there's a reason you want to use it.
Oh, it's legit. Yeah, yeah, that's funny. I mentioned I have a little puffy eye right here because
Yeah.
my 5-year-old, he threw his head back and caught me, and but those are the types of things that you can't plan for, right? It just comes out of nowhere. And if they're gonna fall onto something, it's nice that it's a nice cushiony fall, right?
Yep.
And I brought up one time to a guy, hey, wouldn't you think there'd be a bunch of class action lawsuits in the tire industry and the guys that have been retreading and shaving rubber off of tires?
Yeah.
I rarely do I see those guys with dust masks and things, they would all have cancer. They would all, it would be like, the Roundup commercials. You would see lawyers attacking that from every angle if there was. And he's like, oh, they're just burying all of it. They're just paying those guys off. I'm like, okay, well, we could go around.
We're not that sophisticated.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like the faking the moon landing, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to get that spread out.
Well, I'll tell you what my short line is. And I would say this is mostly true, maybe a little facetious, is I've said the state of California has given recycled rubber a cleaner bill of health than they gave to coffee or chocolate. So,
wow, that's an impressive line. I like that. I'm going to steal that because that's pretty good. Is there anything we missed? This has been a great interview. I really appreciate you coming on. Is there something you wanted to talk about? Maybe something close to your heart?
no, I will say, I think all of us, I think these conversations really, I think the biggest thing is getting the different stakeholders to talk together, because I don't think there's anything in our industry that isn't solvable. We have proven that we can solve it. We have proven that we can handle big cleanups, that we can handle, getting tons of tires, literally hundreds of millions into the flow, create end markets for it. And most of the time when the breakdown occurs, it's just because there's a problem somewhere. And like all the people who need to talk to each other aren't connecting, whether it's ignorance or time, or just we have a lot going on in our day to day. But I think, having opportunities to talk to each other and outside of our industry, it's a big reason I try to spend a lot of time talking to like the Keep America Beautiful affiliates, because they're in that anti-litter space, but they also tend to in local governments as well. I think more of those conversations to make sure people know that we're here to help, and that we're a sustainable industry and a transparent industry, is just something. If I could spend more time doing it, I would.
All right. Well, Stratton Kirton, I appreciate you coming on. Are you going to tell me what the K stands for? Because I noticed on LinkedIn it's K Stratton.
Yeah, I don't tell anybody what the K stands for.
Never tell anybody. All right.
It's part of my history. Yeah.
All right. Stratton Kirton, Liberty Tire, Vice President of Corporate Affairs. I appreciate you coming on, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, sir.